So I think it is 6 o'clock, so we might as well get started. So welcome everybody on behalf of the German-British Association to this rather spontaneous invitation. We felt that we might as well make use of the chances we have doing events like this online with much less work in getting it set up, and make use of it in order to discuss questions that are on everybody's mind at the moment. We're all looking at the UK as the best of friends and still wondering what is actually going on. Just a couple of household remarks. This session will be recorded, and if you don't wish your intervention to be on the record, please tell us either before you speak or afterwards. And secondly, to the members of the public who are listening in, please use the chat function on your screen to make comments or ask questions, and we will pick them up in the course of the next hour or so as we go along. So I'm very happy to welcome three real specialists whom it's worthwhile listening to, who are Stefanie Bolzen, who is the UK correspondent for the German paper Die WELT and WELT am Sonntag, I think, the Sunday paper. It's Tanja Bueltmann, who is a chair in international history at the University of Strathclyde, and is Sir Simon Fraser, who is now the managing partner at Flint Global and he was a permanent secretary in the UK Foreign Office. So we have a really good team. Now, to just introduce the subject very briefly, we hear about fish, we hear about COP26, including certain organizational problems. We hear about lorry drivers, we hear about a conflict of interest scandal, we hear about more moves to get Scotland out of the United Kingdom, and of course we hear about COVID. That's quite a bunch of issues and challenges. So I think our members and friends are interested to learn a little bit more what is actually sort of going on in the UK. We're all pretty bewildered and anxious, and so we'd just like to hear a bit more. Simon, may I start with you? What is going on in the UK at the moment?
Thank you very much. That's a very wide question, so it's a good job that we've got some time to deal with it. I'll just say a few give a few general remarks, if I may, as context for, and then I'm sure we'll dig down into other specific issues. And I think that what I would say is that what's happening in the UK is that we are in a period of flux in the UK. And I think the trouble is that many people are underestimating how long, for example, the consequences of Brexit are going to take to work through. So we're in a period of ongoing change in this country, in the political life of this country. And Brexit is a big part of it, and as seen from continental Europe, that's maybe a primary sort of focus, but I think it's far from the whole story. And to some extent, Brexit is as much a symptom of what's happening in this country as it is the cause of it. And I think that's quite important. So there are a number of issues to disentangle. And of course, overlaid on this in our country, as in other countries, we've had the COVID pandemic, which is confusing everything and making the interpretation of events more difficult. But I think the important thing to understand is there is a fundamental shift going on in politics in Britain and in the way politics is conducted, reflecting some fairly deep changes in our society. And so the old system of politics no longer really applies in this country. And it's very difficult to understand, because we're still in the process of change, exactly what's going on. But essentially, the Conservative Party is changing a lot. It has abandoned Europe. It has abandoned Thatcherism, actually. It has become increasingly a party of sort of nationalism, individualism, and actually increasingly a party which represents working class constituencies and the aspirations of the new working class in this country. And it is abandoning many of the fundamental tenets of conservatism, like low tax, small government, and moving into a very different position. So this is very, very dramatic change, which we need to understand. And similarly, despite the antagonism towards Thatcher, and also just leave it, thanks. And also the austerity measures which the Cameron government introduced, you find the working class, as I say, are voting increasingly for the Conservatives. And actually, it's because they delivered Brexit that many of those people are supporting them. So many of the traditional assumptions are stood on their head. And on the other side, you have a Labour Party which has lost its connections with its working class roots, is seen more increasingly as the representative of metropolitan middle class values and priorities. And so many things are being stood on their head, and we're trying to understand this and work out what it means in the context of Brexit, in the context of our relationships in the world with the United States and others, and equally in the context of what appears to be the weakening of the cohesion of the United Kingdom, as we've seen in Scotland and potentially now as we're seeing in Northern Ireland. So I'll stop there, because that is just introducing a wide range of issues, which I think will play out in our conversation.
Very good, thank you. Thank you very much. Stefanie, would you agree to what's just been said, or would you, as an observer, a German observer in the UK, would you have different priorities?
Well, thank you first of all for having me, and thank you to Simon. I mean, he already summarized rather well what is going on in this country. In a way, I feel incredibly lucky, and don't misunderstand me, but it's a fascinating time in the UK. Actually, my first assignment back in 2013 was the so-called Bloomberg speech by David Cameron when he dropped the idea of a referendum. I had just been appointed here to London, and I had spent the 4 years before in Brussels. So I knew a little bit what the European Union is about and what the institutions are about, and how complex this the whole project of the European Union is. And I was surprised how you would think that you could easily leave that club and that would go smoothly. And what we've seen, obviously, after the referendum between 2016 and 2019 was a complete turmoil. And I think what we saw in Parliament, especially during the year of 2019 or 2018, 2019, with all those votes and Theresa May losing time and again the vote, that really contributed even more to the sense of a lot of people saying, we voted for Brexit, why don't they just get it done? And I remember very vividly traveling actually to Wales before the December election, when Boris Johnson then was elected properly as Prime Minister, and getting the sense out there that people, they didn't really care what kind of person Boris Johnson is, and they forgave him anything. They just said, he gets it done, he's full of optimism, it can't get worse, we just go for it. I mean, this was just taking Wales, for example, which was one of the areas with the highest recipient of getting EU money. They voted for Brexit. It's really, really difficult to get your head around. Now, one thing I must say, I'm living in this country and I'm shouting this over the channel. We have food, we have electricity, and we have fuel. So what the German media is telling you is not true. So now, on a serious point, I think, and there's a danger in there. I think not only the German media, whether it's the French, the Dutch, they tend to paint a picture of Britain in ways that is, of course, accurate, but also in some points it's exaggerated. And I think on both sides, we have to be careful how we report. And I'm also talking, obviously, about the British media, how they report on Brussels. And that's something, and I'm sure Tanja very much agrees, because she so much lives this day in, day out, the tension and the the attacks that you also get being a European living in the UK is at times really upsetting. I mean, I've got a very thick skin by now, but it's something that we should all care about, because it takes us nowhere. And now coming back to what the point Simon made, I had a very interesting observation at the last Tory party conference, and then I stopped rambling. And sometimes you find these things more on the fringe of a party conference. So I listened to the speech by Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, and it was a speech that you could never hear in Germany at a CDU party conference. It was constantly putting illegal immigrants in the context of rape and crime. It was, I found, a really xenophobic party conference speech. She got so, I mean, the party loves her, obviously. And then afterwards, I talked to some people in the room and I said, so why is people so fond of the Home Secretary? And someone said, because they finally do what they need to do. And the stark contrast between, say, the Conservative government one, which was Cameron and May, this ended in 2019. This is a new party. It's not the old Tory party, not only because of Thatcherism. It's also a more populist, more nationalistic party, I think. And that's an important thing to have in mind. And we don't even start talking about Boris Johnson. And I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Of course, we're relieved to hear that Christmas dinner is safe in the UK. But what you've been telling us, particularly about the Tory party, is actually quite disquieting, looking at it from the continent or from Germany. I turn to Tanja, who has a sort of academic look at it all. What are sort of the deeper reasons for all this? Why are politics sort of changing and shifting so much, as both Simon and Stefanie have just explained to us?
Well, first of all, thank you from me too for having me on this panel. It's really fascinating, and both Stefanie and Simon have already made so many great points that I would also share and agree with. And I do indeed bring that sort of academic perspective, and I'm happy to talk about that a little bit. But just to say, I'm also, of course, an EU citizen, so I also distinctly bring that perspective with me, although I'm now also a British citizen, so maybe there's another dimension to that now as well. And I'm a resident in Scotland. So again, if we think about issues to do with the union, there's another angle that we might wish to explore. Now, from the more sort of academic perspective, as a historian, of course, I'm particularly interested in, or have always been, how perhaps past patterns can help us understand some developments in the present. We have to be really careful here. I want to be clear on that, because I see this often in current debates, particularly actually in relation to comparisons with Germany, how we try to draw direct comparisons, or actually I think we rather shouldn't draw these direct comparisons. But what we can of course try to do is understand, as I say, some of these patterns in terms of how particular leaders and populism emerges and develops at different points in time. And this is not something that happened last week with the latest scandal around Owen Paterson, for instance, not even during the pandemic with questions around corruption and COVID contracts, let's say. But actually, let's go back to the year when 2019, when Boris Johnson prorogued Parliament, for instance. I was aghast at the time that there wasn't more of an outcry. I distinctly remember that I went to London a day earlier than I had planned for a meeting because there had been a protest, and I foolishly, it turned out, assumed that there'd be another protest on the next day. But there wasn't. So if you look at the history of movements, this I think is one of the characteristics we've seen throughout the whole Brexit period, that this activism that we've seen in the UK has been much more limited than elsewhere. And that I think explains a little bit why we are where we are. Sporadic activity, one-off protests, they're just not going to change things particularly strongly or help with that. So that's one perspective I think we can consider in the context of this. But then I also want to say that I think Brexit in itself is actually empty. Nobody has really defined Brexit, and that's why it's so dangerous. Everybody can sort of interpret any and all manner of things into it. So it's a really good tool, therefore, for populism to thrive. And that's, as I say, why I think it is now so potent, because it can be twisted and turned into pretty much anything. But what it does require is an other. So you need to be able to define against someone else. So that's the EU. Often it's Germany. Currently, it's particularly France. And so there are all sorts of dynamics in that draw on all sort of animosities, draw on the war. None of this is new, really. You know, as Germans, we certainly know a good bit of that as well. But this is what's now much heightened, and Brexit's kind of brought this out in ways that are potentially really quite dangerous, actually, coming together with some of the points previously made about how media reporting, for instance, works as well. So that's, I think, a point to make. But finally, let me just also bring in that slightly more personal dimension again of actually EU citizens in the UK as well, because we've had a very direct experience already of the impact of this type of populism, because every EU citizen at home in the UK already had to apply to stay. And for those not so familiar perhaps with the situation, it really was that an application process. So not just, you know, turn up and get a stamp situation. No, you had to apply to stay. And actually well over 40% of EU citizens currently only hold a temporary status. So they're going to have to apply again. So when I think about populism, and I think also about shifting goalposts now outside of the EU, now we have the withdrawal agreement, but even within that is actually quite a bit of flex. So these are the sort of concerns I have, that in the context within which we now operate, a populist nationalistic UK government, what's next then for particular groups? And that's already expanding as a final point. If you think, for instance, about the comments made by Dominic Raab recently about the Human Rights Act. So to me, in some ways, EU citizens were just the guinea pigs for all sorts of questions about limiting rights of people. And that to me is one of the greatest challenges we're now faced with.
Okay, thank you. That's certainly some food for discussion. And I invite the other panelists to respond in a minute. I just want to say, by what you've been saying, I'm sort of troubled, what you've all been saying, I'm sort of troubled that two groups of citizens in the UK, whom I would always have said are pretty large, they've sort of vanished from sight. The one group is the pro-Europeans. I mean, after all, the largest pro-European public demonstration ever anywhere in Europe took place in London in 2019. And the other group of people is sort of the old-fashioned, yes, Tories, conservatives in the country. They too seem to have sort of vanished from sight and given way to these new kind of people. Where are they? Where are they in public discussion? But please pick up on anything else, Simon.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, I'll try and pick up on a couple of points. Those people still exist, but the point is that the political discourse has shifted quite dramatically as a result of Brexit. And actually, Robert Shrimsley has just written a very good article in the Financial Times about how successfully the pro-Brexit side of politics has shifted the territory, so that the pro-Europeans and the anti-Brexit people no longer feel confident to come forward and make the case. I mean, in a sense, you are denigrated if you do that at the moment. It's quite difficult. So that space in political discourse has been squeezed for the time being. I think it's really important to say, however, that, I mean, there are many people in this country who didn't favor Brexit. There is not a very strong public sentiment that really favors the EU or thinks the EU is performing well at the moment. I mean, the EU, those of us who believe in the principle and the idea of the European Union and solidarity between European democracies, still have some difficulty in making a very positive case for the performance of the European Union and some of the governments in the European Union. So I think it is important to make that slightly counterbalancing point. And on this question about populism and politics in the UK, which I have contributed to describing myself, I think it is important to say, yes, I agree that at the moment we have a government which is defining itself almost against Europe and against the European Union and is antagonistic towards the EU, because that is the way its domestic political base works. That is where the politics takes it, and we have to bear that in mind. Nevertheless, the whole story is not necessarily negative. I mean, there is outreach to other parts of the world. There is an attempt to create an agenda around innovation and dynamism in the British economy in different ways. I think it's an open question whether that can succeed. And of course, there is this sort of sweeping under the carpet of the 4% damage to the British economy, which flows from Brexit. But nevertheless, I think it's quite important to say, other panelists may challenge this, but there is a sense of activism and to some extent opportunity in the UK, which it would be wrong to sort of discount completely. So for those of us who were against Brexit, I think we have to recognize that things have moved on. There is a bit of a new mood, but there are very many questions about where it's going to take us.
Thank you. Stefanie, any comments on that?
Yeah, maybe because I already saw a question regarding Northern Ireland in the chat, and I think this is one of the topics we really need to talk about. And
please do. Please do. Yeah.
So I'm really worried about this. So all signs are that after COP26, Boris Johnson, of course, is the host of COP26, and say malign sources say he avoids it for now, but once COP26, where he has to be the mediator, is done and dusted, if it ever can be dusted, but that's a different topic, they look at somehow triggering the so-called Article 16. So Article 16 is a kind of a safeguard clause in the Northern Ireland Protocol. It's not, it's quite, it's not very defined, but basically it's saying if there's a threat to trade or basically the well-being of people in Northern Ireland, then one of the two parties can pause or freeze the agreements. We have there was already a kind of a pre-show, a warm-up to all this, which was the row last week between France and the UK about the fishing rights. And I thought it's quite interesting if you talk to people in Brussels, because then, as you know, in the last moment, the French president went back from the brink and did not put into reality his threats about stopping the trade between Calais and Dover and so on. But actually, my sense is that in Brussels, they quite liked what the French president did, because it was showing the muscles of what the European Union can do. Now you have that on the south side of the channel. On the north side of the channel, you have a prime minister who's absolutely ready to trigger Article 16, even though it will be in a very, in a very calibrated way. And they will, in a calibrated way, break international law. Now, the repercussions will be massive. And also we should talk about Ireland and what that means for Ireland. And also it maneuvers the European Union in a position where in the end, they cannot afford building up a land border between the British Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland to protect the single market. So there won't be a border. And the British side will see, well, see, we don't really need a land border there. And so it is quite a malign game going on. It's perfidious as from the British side what's going on. And at the end of the day, the big question is, what is the gain? What is the gain for the British side? And then, of course, you have the suspicion, because Brexit is not going very well and a lot of other things are not going well. So Brexit still has a function which is as a means of distracting from other things and at the same time whipping up nationalistic feelings towards Europe. And you can, unfortunately, in certain British media, see this day by day. And therefore, the Northern Ireland Protocol and the problems around it is something really closely to watch and very carefully to handle for the people responsible, I think.
Thank you. Just two remarks before I give the floor to our chairman. The first one is that we now have over 130 people listening in, which by our standards is a pretty good turnout, actually. So there obviously is a real interest in this discussion. The second remark, I just wanted to tell you all that I've been challenged with my remark that the pro-Europeans have vanished. Somebody has written, we haven't disappeared. My theory is that the pro-EU lose out in two ways. The press denies our existence, and two, the pro-EU are also much more considerate of others, and a pandemic is from an ideal environment to get out on the streets. So that to be fair, I did just want to read that out. Now, Thomas, Chairman of the German-British Society.
Sorry, a very short remark. I find it quite impressive what the panelists said about the mood in Britain. but I see for us, Königswinter here, an enormous challenge, an opportunity and a challenge. And a challenge is this: the German political class and the public in general have become very tired of all the shenanigans we read in the media and what's going on the other side of the channel. So the danger is that we say, okay, the Brits made up their minds, they are gone, so let's turn to the future, and then perhaps throwing out the baby with the bathwater, neglecting the fact that we need Britain on many issues, globally, on the European level, bilaterally, for economy, politically. And the challenge and the task for us, especially Königswinter, will be to really remind people, whatever is happening on the other side, they have just not disappeared. And I think it's very telling that the declaration, the joint declaration of the two foreign ministers on the future cooperation of foreign security policy between the two countries expressly names this big task for Königswinter. This just as an insert for us and for the German Königswinter to keep at the back of your minds.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Thomas. Tanja, do you get the impression, as a German living in the UK and in Scotland in particular, do you get the impression that interest in the UK is sort of waning, is going away in the rest of Europe? Are the Europeans getting tired of it? Should we be doing more to sort of promote an interest?
It must be really difficult now. That's mostly what I keep thinking, because I remember right after the referendum, there was actually so much love, I mean, genuinely, and a sense of sort of being distraught. Maybe especially in Germany, I don't know, but I think there were a lot of people who were completely flabbergasted and really didn't expect that. My father among them, for instance, even though I had been certainly telling all of them for a long time that I thought Brexit was definitely going to come. But I think now there's been a noticeable shift, and maybe that's just a sort of sense of being annoyed or being tired of it. I kind of get that. I guess the one thing I would say, and maybe by that I'm kind of flipping your question for today's event actually on its head. I'm not sure we're asking the right question. In my view, we need to be asking what's going on in England. That is not to say that problems don't exist elsewhere. Stefanie's comments have made so very clear what the big problems are in Northern Ireland. But to my mind, everything that's at the root cause of all of these problems is particular to England and the political system enshrined in the current UK setup, which is so dominated by England. And looking at that from a Scottish perspective, but one would have to make very similar points from, say, a Northern Ireland perspective. It just isn't a union anymore already. If at best it's a union of unequals, and Brexit has brought that out so very strongly, because what should have happened following the referendum was to say something like, okay, the devolved nations have had different views on this, let's sit around the table and talk about what we can do. Or even better still, one should have had a safeguard in the actual referendum to prevent a situation like that, that you could have such different views completely ignored in the outcome of negotiations and so on. So that's the position now. And I think that's why my message to Europe, for starters, would be don't treat it all as the same. There really are quite diverse views. And it's not just a point about England against everybody else. We have seen in the chat how strong a pro-EU movement there still is. There have been various references rightly to that. What is lacking, I suppose, there is a head figure, is someone who actually, you know, kind of tries maybe in some new ways to kind of bring this out into the open. And that's really difficult, I think, at this juncture, because there is no immediate rejoin opportunity. So how would you frame this? What would you do? But that's exactly, I think, where groups like the Deutsch-Britische Gesellschaft can help. The soft power, the cultural soft power in these kinds of groups. So just events like this, talking to people, bringing these on board. Maybe, I think there was a reference in the chat to some new newspapers online and that are really growing. You know, maybe there can be more engagement through these kinds of media. So I think that would help.
Thank you. Well, of course, we really like at the Deutsch-Britische Gesellschaft, German British Society, we really like what you've just been saying, because that's exactly what we are trying to do. But Simon, without really knowing whether you see yourself as an Englishman or a Scot or a Welshman, would you agree that we need to sort of look at various nations of the UK, as they're now called, very sort of distinctly and separately?
Well, I consider myself to be a British European. I don't know if that helps very much. It is definitely true. Can I just make one other point? I thought before I come back, there was a very interesting challenge in the chat also that we should have somebody who represents the pro-Brexit point of view. And I think it is important to just build on that. I mean, as I was active in the Remain campaign, so I certainly don't fit that bill. But I think it's very important in our conversation, whatever, to understand that this has happened and that the country is in different ways moving on from it, although I personally believe it's going to take a very long time for that to happen. And somehow we need to integrate into our discussion and conversation the acceptance of that. And then to Thomas's point, how do we actually manage to extract some positives, or at least damage what we manage what we might consider to be the negatives going forward? And there's some very other interesting comments in the chat about whether the British government really wants a relationship with the EU, which I don't think it does, with the EU per se. Doesn't really, not particularly interested in that, other than a functional level. But it says it wants strong bilateral relationships with European countries and the members of the EU. Personally, I'm a bit skeptical as to whether those two things are compatible, at least in the short term, as we're seeing with France at the moment. But I just wanted to sort of come back to that point about making sure we're not just all violently agreeing with each other without taking account of the context. Now, on your question, I think I definitely agree that what you're seeing is partly as a consequence of Brexit, but this is something which was happening anyway, is a weakening over the bonds of the Union of the United Kingdom. And remember, the Scotland thing was happening before. We had the referendum in 2014. And clearly, I think this has been, that this will be give further energy to that process. And we have seen something which is largely linked to English nationalism, driving a lot of what we're seeing in terms of the politics we've been talking about. And Northern Ireland, I think, coming back to the Northern Ireland issue and going beyond the specific question of Article 16, it does seem to me that almost an inevitable consequence of Brexit and what we're seeing play out now is a weakening of the relationship between the mainland and Northern Ireland, and a sense of pushing further towards some sort of unification of Ireland over time. Seems to me to be something which can certainly not be discounted, and it is probably more possible, a bit probable, than it was before. So yes, I think we do have to take this into account very seriously.
But that would mean if Northern Ireland goes, so to speak, and there certainly are indicators that say this may very well happen, then probably Scotland would think very seriously about going as well, and that would leave England and Wales. Wales, I would feel, does not want to go, but Scotland might. So that would leave England and Wales as the sort of the remainder of the United Kingdom. Is that something that is at all foreseeable?
Are you asking me?
Any of you who'd like to pick that rather thorny issue up?
Well, I think
sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, since you all want to say something, Simon, you go first, and then yeah.
I think we've got some feedback on. Very quickly, from my perspective, I think that the British government is clearly very concerned about this, and is going to do everything it can to prevent it from happening. And I think that the reality for the Scots and others may look rather more challenging than the sort of aspiration, if you see what I mean. So I think there's a lot to play for, but I think we do have to take this agenda seriously.
Tanja?
Yeah, I think that's certainly true. To be honest, though, I'm not sure the UK government is doing all it can, because it's put people in place who couldn't be any more unsuited to the job, in the sense that they immediately antagonize the people they're meant to convince to sort of keep them on board. So I think this is an interesting question. But for all viewpoints on this, I think it has brought into sharp relief differences in society. And actually, the pandemic has heightened perhaps the sense around that, you know, how we look after each other or not, you know, what's the very fabric of society. So I suppose that makes this even harder now, because if the pandemic hadn't been there, we might be having some different types of conversations around the feasibility now, whereas now so much, I think someone made the point before, is kind of partly hidden in some of the pandemic fallouts. But I also wanted to, if I may, just pick up one more point from the chat, because someone asked what I thought was a really good question about the position of the Labour Party, which is clearly so difficult now, especially in light of comments yesterday by Keir Starmer about not wanting to rejoin the EU. And to me, this is one of the biggest challenges that I suppose, let's call it the Remain movement, what, you know, used to be that anyway, pro-Europeans in the UK are being faced with. I saw a lot of different opinions on this on Twitter, and I can understand all of them from a heart perspective, in the sense that I too would wish to, I'm sure, rejoin the EU if I was in that position. But I think it's really important that there is a strong sense of realism in it. I think it's just not a viable position to have right now. So how does one move forward from that? And that brings me to the Labour position. My view is that the biggest elephant in the room still has not been tackled, which continues to be migration, because that is ultimately what to a significant extent delivered the result in the first place last time round. And Labour is just like last time, basically still sweeping that under the carpet, or worse, pandering to the kind of Tory policies of the type that Stefanie, maybe you saw at the conference in Priti Patel's speech. So my advice, and I know this is quite specific because I'm also an EU citizen, I'm also a migration historian, but I really think that's the biggest thing that needs to be addressed. We have to have a good, proper conversation in the UK about immigration, because if that doesn't happen still, as it didn't in the lead up to the EU referendum, it will just be pulled out of the bag again. Labour needs to get to a point where it can support freedom of movement, because that makes possible all sorts of other scenarios in future, even if that isn't full EU membership. So that would be my one piece of kind of advice, if I may give that to the movement, to think about how that can be supported.
You certainly may. Stefanie, that's several issues. It's the Labour Party, it's still Scotland and Northern Ireland, and it's migration. Please.
Wow, that's a lot of questions. Don't know if I can even start to answer one of those. If we go back to migration, and that's a very good point that Tanja made, it is really the elephant in the room. It is very, very toxic. And I mean, from an observer's perspective, but even, and I would like to confront Simon with that, what his thoughts are there. But if you look at, say, the record of the last weeks and months of the Johnson government, the latest sleaze stories last week, that U-turn after the Owen Paterson episode, in a night, just changing all the rules for one MP, and then actually backtracking again. The Sunday papers had a lot of stories of the Tory party taking millions for installing donors as lords in the House of Lords. I mean, it seems like a completely corrupted system, but still, it doesn't really stick. It doesn't. I mean, the Boris Johnson's popularity is weakening a little bit, but not really. And the question, of course, is why does the Labour Party not get through? Is it the leader? Is he not charismatic enough? Is Labour not still trying to please all sides, whether it's the urban, more educated, and at the same time the old, what used to be the red wall? They find themselves somehow in an impossible position. But I still, I mean, these little things that you hear when you travel. So I was in Cornwall for G7 and spent a lot of time in shuttle buses between the different places, talking to people who had taken jobs on at the G7. And I asked them what they think about Boris Johnson and why they thought he was a good prime minister. And it was, of course, the vaccines. And it was, of course, the furlough scheme. I mean, the furlough in Germany would be Kurzarbeit, is something that we almost were used to it in Germany as a good scheme to save or keep people being at the work where they are, and not once they are redundant to try desperately to get them back. But the furloughing, as far as I know, was something really a new concept in Britain. And I met a lot of people who are just incredibly grateful for Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak that they introduced this, and that actually the economy is going quite well. And maybe it's also a cultural thing that people are more open to the jump into the unknown. It's not something we don't like that being German, but here in the UK, it's something you take more of a risk. They're more of risk takers. We saw that very much in the how Britain approached the vaccine question, while Europe was far more cautious. In Britain, you got an entrepreneur and she sorted it. So there's a very different approach to that. The question of Northern Ireland and Scotland, I mean, there was one question I think about, would the European Union have Scotland? I mean, every time I ask in Brussels or in Berlin, they don't want to say that they want Scotland. Once it would be a constitutionally legal referendum, we are in a different place. But for now, if there was a referendum in 2023 in Scotland, I don't think the Scottish will get an official endorsement of independence of Scotland. I don't think so. And when it comes to Northern Ireland, this is even more complicated because, because of the Good Friday Agreement, there has to be first a poll in the north and then the south. If that ever happened, as far as I understand, this has to be also given permission in London to have the poll in the first place. But Tanja is really right that I think there's very little interest in London what happens to Northern Ireland. Actually, I meet more Germans who know about the troubles in Northern Ireland than I meet English people. I mean, this is a harsh thing to say, but that's really my experience of the last years. And so, unfortunately, I think Northern Ireland has become like a pawn in the whole game. And that's something very, very dangerous and can have caused terrible damage in many respects.
Thank you. I just want to read out what somebody put here. If Scotland and Northern Ireland leave, I don't see, says David, England and Wales lasting any longer than Serbia and Montenegro did. This is quite a strong statement, actually, and I wonder whether any of you would like to sort of come back to that. But there is another thing which I can't resist missing out. A question from Marilyn Peter Lancashire. How many parallels are there between the British Conservative Party, the AfD in Germany, and Le Front National? All are populists letting the left behind vent their rage at the system? Would you see the Tories in that bracket? Simon. I mean, it's quite a frightening perspective, actually.
I don't think that's the case. I mean, the Conservative Party is still representing a very mainstream spectrum of opinion in this country, but it has definitely shifted in a populist direction linked specifically to Brexit. I think I'll go back to what I said at the beginning. I mean, it's really important to think through and understand this shift in British politics. I mean, on the Labour Party point, there are two issues, I think. First of all, the Labour Party is still bitterly divided by its own ideological internal rifts. But Corbyn did an awful lot to damage the Labour Party. And frankly, if Corbyn hadn't been the leader of the Labour Party, I think probably we wouldn't have lost the referendum. The referendum would have probably gone the other way with a different Labour leader. And also Boris Johnson wouldn't have the size of majority that he has now. So the new leader is dealing with that. And also, but this is equally important, the Labour Party has lost its traditional working class base. The traditional class-based British politics doesn't work anymore. And it is amazing to me that the working class people in the north of England, who are the people who Thatcher put out of jobs 20 years ago, are the people who are now holding up and supporting the Conservative Party. What a shift that has been. And that's what the Labour Party has got to get its head round and understand and reposition itself around. And I think the Labour is finding that a huge challenge. And the Conservatives, you know, they are very good at spotting where power lies and where the trends go. And they are not shackled by ideology, let's say, to put it mildly, in the pursuit of their political interest. And they have shifted onto this ground. But I don't think that places them in any way in the same category as what you might call an extreme right party of the sort that you've described.
Would you agree?
And they
to
have
that?
a charismatic leader, by the way, who people give the benefit of the doubt. And part of the question is, at what point will people stop giving him the benefit of the doubt? Hence the interesting questions about sleaze and so forth.
Yeah. And would you agree to that?
It's a difficult question, and I do think we have to be careful with how we assess this, because again, a direct comparison is probably not actually the best approach to try and understand this. And that's not a fudged answer. I genuinely think that is how it is. But what I would say is that to me, all of these things, the changes in the Conservative Party, just as much as the AfD, actually former President Trump as well, if you want a clearer example, are essentially outcomes of the same type of problem as is Brexit itself, of this new populism that we see emerge everywhere. So you might also look at Hungary, of course, as another example. But if you look back, you know, just to the 6th of January in the US and what happened there, for instance, the forces that really genuinely have been unleashed, that's like, you know, several levels up from where we are in any of these other places. But that's where it can end up. And yes, of course, in the US are some specific dynamics that we don't have anywhere else. So again, we have to be really careful. But they still all relate to the same type of populism, particularly also again focused on this anti-immigrant hate, all the sort of deliberate hate stirring, where the truth hasn't just become a variable, it's been stretched into complete oblivion, essentially, where words are being uttered by ministers in government or other politicians in some of these other countries that have real life consequences for ordinary people. I don't know if people in Germany are familiar with this story, but for instance, Priti Patel a while ago spoke against what she called activist lawyers. A little while later, a man went into a legal practice with a knife and was essentially sort of citing her. What's come out of all of that? So many things have been normalized. So whether that's through some things like similar to what the AfD have done, which is more extreme in some ways, or actually this normalized much more mainstream politics, which is actually the more dangerous one, would be my question. So to me, I have to say, I see this a bit more bleakly, perhaps might be a way to describe this than Simon. I have to say, I'm genuinely really concerned, because I think democracy has already been hollowed out a lot more than perhaps some of our discussions here let on. And I particularly worry about this because the withdrawal agreement is not precise enough in many areas. So a lot of things, and actually not just in the Brexit context, but also for some policy areas, can now be shaped essentially through what we call Henry VIII powers or secondary legislation. So a minister can just change certain things. So there is a lot of scope in there if someone wanted to really abuse that further in an anti-democratic way that we haven't seen before.
Simon, your word of comfort about the Tory party as opposed to AfD and Front National is challenged here. Marc de Marcillac says, but so many ex-UKIP and Brexit party members are now in the Conservative Party that the latter is now truly populist, nationalistic and anti-immigration. And Catherine Ginn adds, very dark forces are whipping this up. It is impossible to see any one nation in isolation. Would you still stick with your opinion? Yes, you would, but perhaps you'd like to add to that.
Well, I don't deny that, there are forces of what you might call the right who have moved into the mainstream Conservative Party. Of course, UKIP was a party which was fundamentally found its feet in opposing the European Union, but it had other strands to it as well. All I'm saying is that the Conservative Party is a long-established party, which is traditionally the party of power. You might say in this country, it is a mainstream party, and it can absorb some of these views, I think. It's not a sort of small insurgent right-wing party in and of its own right. The other point, and by the way, you know, look, it looks like they're going to win the next election. So to do that, they're going to have to command broad support across the country. So, you know, either the whole country is becoming extremist or they are still representing a fairly broad spectrum of opinion. The other thing I'd just say is, you know, I didn't welcome Brexit any more than anybody else did. I was against it and I thought it was a great shame. But one thing I'd say is that having gone through this trauma, and it's a massive trauma, it's a huge trauma politically, but the institutions of the British state have more or less withstood it. I mean, I recognize all the examples that have been cited about sort of breaches of the law, and unfortunately, but the institutions of the British state have more or less held up in a way that actually I think we ought to give recognition to.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Quite obviously for our audience, the whole issue of the Tory party that you raised, that you all commented on, is very much at the center of their attention. And I'd just like to read out one or two other comments. Stefan Lewandowski says, unfortunately, much of the UK tabloid press is using language that is incompatible with democratic values, and at least tacitly, that trend is supported and encouraged by the Tory party. I recognize that John Major is a decent man, as are some others, but overall, I think it is advisable not to put too much trust, if any, in the democratic commitment of the Tory party. Their actions speak against that. They unlawfully shut down Parliament and paid no political price. This would be unimaginable in any other democracy. And Martin Campbell says, is there a path back to sane politics in the UK? If so, what is it? A proportional representation, a new political party, a split in one of the two main parties? Well, that is quite a big sort of handful. Who would like to pick that up? Anybody? Stefanie, would you like to comment?
I mean, I just would like to make a short comment on what Simon just said about the institution that held up, for example, in the case of the prorogation and the Supreme Court saying that that was actually illegal, and other things. But, and I'm not saying I share this, but again, I try only to observe it. There's an increasing sense that there is an undermining of those very institutions, whether it's the civil servants. See, for example, the case of the bullying claims against Priti Patel, against I think he was a permanent secretary. There was no real consequences of that. That Home Secretary is still in place. If you look at the question, who's going to be the next head of Ofcom? So allegedly, Boris Johnson wants Paul Dacre, the former head of the Daily Mail, to become the head of Ofcom. Obviously, Paul Dacre is, let's say, without Paul Dacre, he's one of those who, without him, probably there wouldn't have been Brexit. The board that is making the decision who becomes the next head of Ofcom, maybe we should briefly explain. Ofcom is, I don't know what you could really compare it to in Germany. It's the, what would you compare it to in Germany? It's the board that regulates the telecommunication, but also the media. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Would you say it that way?
Yeah.
So highly important, very important to have an independent person at the head of this. Paul Dacre was not elected by this body, and now the process is still in limbo, and Boris Johnson is still trying to install him. There are other cases like last week, what happened in Parliament, that quickly, rules are changed just for the benefit of one party. The constant culture war against the BBC. And I can understand why people in other parts that is not London say this is a biased institution, and they are so London focused, and they are all very comfortable in their nice North London homes, and report in a way about our country that is just to their own benefit. I do get all that. But there is a general feeling of it doesn't feel right. And Simon, please correct me, but don't you think that there is something creeping in that is wrong, or is it only Jonathan Freedland and the Guardian who's a bit hysteric?
Simon, do you want to react immediately?
Well, I don't want to hog the microphone, but I do agree with you. Clearly, as a former civil servant, I've watched these things and I am very concerned about it. But you know, the other side of that is that there is still a pretty vibrant and open public debate in this country in politics. And you know, the media, you may not like it, but it is still a tremendous media with still a reasonable range of views in it, despite the tabloids. So I think it's important. Just, you know, we're very good at airing our dirty linen in this country, frankly, and having it on view, which in some other European countries you don't see as much. In terms of public debate. So, you know, there are strengths still in the system, but I fully recognize the concerns that you described, and they are real concerns.
Tanja.
What is there to add to that? No, I actually just want to echo Stefanie's points again. I'm afraid I see this really as a much more dangerous point already. I think institutions are not holding up, really. They might occasionally still make the right decisions, but do they have any effect? Are they being treated in the way they should be treated? Or does it take, 2 seconds for a minister to tweet something about activist lawyers to, fan the flames of hate further against the legal system and kind of come back to the traitor type headlines we saw immediately after the referendum. So I'm really quite concerned about that. The other point to make, of course, is that while there are certainly some debates still, the media plays a role here that is worrying, partly because of how it's concentrated in particular hands and what that means in practice, how views are being heard, who gets to say what. The whole discussion around cancel culture or the culture wars, there is no culture war. It's completely fabricated. And I wish people would say that more. It is a made up thing. Why? Because it's noise. It's just to create noise, a distraction for all of this sort of chaos. So in that sense, here's another, well, maybe not piece of advice, but another thought of how I think we need to move forward, which would be not to give that noise even more exposure by engaging with it, but by building the platform that is there of pro-Europeans. But it must be in a way where we can agree to disagree with Brexit supporters. There's no point in shouting at people or in causing further divisions than in society alongside these divisions we see elsewhere. And that's what's so difficult, because this is still raw. And in some respects, I sometimes think as EU citizens, I don't want to say we have it easier, but we've been exposed to this for much longer already, since even before the referendum, having been the subject of so much hate and all these newspaper front pages. So in some ways, I always feel that many of us perhaps have become more kind of not accommodated, but come to terms with what happened a bit more already, whereas in the kind of pro-EU groups, that's still so much more raw, and that's maybe a challenge now as well. But anyway, I think there are these tensions in society and in the institutions, and for that to be happening at the same time, again, made worse by the pandemic, because that's brought out so many other problems, I think it's really worrying.
Thank you. I think that's what people are saying in the chat room, and with a lot of comments, good comments on various aspects. Brexit split families and friendships. Somebody said the UK is very much an elective dictatorship. UK democracy is in real danger. And then, as a sort of way out, in a way, a written constitution would be a good start. Things are not holding up at all. So it's really, there's a lot of concern there with people. We have people who've logged in both from Germany and the UK. So I think it's a very general feeling of concern. Does this mean the UK is sort of sliding down a slippery slope, or does it mean UK will pick up the pieces and sort of start afresh? What is your feeling as sort of final theme? Simon, what do you think will happen in the near future? We won't pin you down to it next year.
I see I'm being accused described in the chat as being defensive and a typical establishment Remainer. But I think it's really just important in these debates that we, that we don't all just say the same thing, and B, that we don't overreact. I mean, I am no happier than anybody else about what's happening in this country, but I want to try and remain sort of as dispassionate as I can about it and analysing it. I think that's quite important. I think if you look at the future, I'm very concerned about the future of the country. I'm very concerned about the orientation of this government. I'm concerned about the lack of clarity about what Brexit is and where it's taking us. On the other hand, I have a certain amount of confidence in the sort of the energy, ingenuity, and character of the British people, and I don't think I would write that off. And on your point about whether we will regenerate, I mean, I think this is a long-term question, but I do notice there's quite a lot of, I mean, in the business that I now work in, there's quite a lot of inward investment still sort of coming to this country, maybe because assets are cheap or whatever, but there are certain people around the world who seem to feel that there is a future in the UK and a future model. Whether they're right or wrong, I don't feel able definitively to say, but I just think it's important to look at both sides of the question.
Thank you. Tanja, what's your feeling? Yep. Will the UK find its way out of this mess?
I am a historian. I look into the past, not into the future. That's my cop-out answer. No, of course not.
Most historians, I'm a historian myself, and most historians now absolutely love to look into the future.
Well, it's difficult. I think, you know, one of the things I've always asked people for a really long time, you know, what is the stop point? Like, at what point will there be enough momentum for something to positively change or become, you know, more and more extreme? And this is what worries me. I can't currently see that. You know, what is this kind of stop or triggering point? So I would hope, I think we are on a slippery slope. I don't think it is an overreaction to say that, but it is a concern. And I would hope that we can facilitate better discussions, and they have to be on the basis of what I said before, the sort of ability to agree to disagree, to have conversations with people about the local dimensions of some of this. There's actually a really good hook in that sense for community focus and for activities to do that. But there needs to be buy-in from a lot of people. And ideally, of course, there should be government support for some of these initiatives. Everybody should wish to bring the country together again more. And I don't mean this as a kind of Union Jack style kind of thing. No, but just as communities, we all live in this country, immigrants, British citizens, and we need to try and work towards that. So I know that doesn't quite answer your question, but that would be my hope maybe for the future, that we get onto a path of that, because if that fails, that there's no fabric left, and we have to maintain that fabric.
Thank you, Stefanie.
I'm actually also a historian by training, but my job is now to describe the now and not the future. There was one very good question in the chat asking about when will the economic consequences of Brexit being felt? And I mean, this is so difficult, and it has become even more difficult because of the pandemic. So how do you distinguish between the effects of COVID and lockdowns and everything else that's going on in the world and Brexit? But I think we have seen a glimpse now because of the shortages of workers, whether it's the lorry drivers or whether it's, I mean, I know in London we are living probably much better than in other parts of the UK, and especially in rural areas. And someone in the chat was also making that point. But you notice it. You notice this in the shop. You notice that in the, especially in hospitality, when you go out for drinks or dinner, there's always everywhere a shortage of staff, and this is certainly an effect of Brexit. And it's going to be a challenge for the government, and interesting to see how they solve it. And they try to somehow secretly then a contingency here and another rule there and a couple of visa there, but it doesn't really work. So in that sense, we will feel it. But then again, I agree with Simon that this is an amazing country. It's full of creativity. There's so much money here. There's so much interest investing in the UK that there are two things, one more negative and one more positive. One thing about the future, I really want to make this point, which I find personally very upsetting, is that young people from Germany and other countries can't come to the UK anymore. It's almost impossible. They can come for a holiday, only if they have a passport. My niece wanted to visit me. She doesn't have a passport. She can't come because since the 1st of October, you need a passport. You can't travel on your ID. So it's really made really difficult to visit the UK, to come here to work, to do internships. You can't do internships. You can't do au pair. You can't study really in the UK anymore because it's so expensive. It costs you more than 30,000 euro a year in tuition fees. So that's something on the short run that civil society, institutions, academic institutions, we really have to invest in that and make sure that the next generation knows each other. Like for us, it was normal. We did Erasmus, we traveled, you could do Interrail, whatever. And that's made difficult. And I think this is a damage we all personally can maybe help a little bit to mitigate.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Now, of course, to be fair, one has to say that quite a big chunk of the challenges the UK is facing are faced by any other country just as much. I mean, we're all facing COVID-19. We're all facing a degree of mistrust in institutions. We're all facing a crisis of national governments and so on. So that is not just the UK. But if you just leave that, there is still quite a lot of UK-specific challenges to be met, and I think these have come out very, very clearly in this discussion. I think we've broken a record of the number of interventions in the chat. We've never had such an active discussion in the chat room, and I would like to say a big thank you to all of you who've made use of the opportunity. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to pick up on many of the points raised, but I hope we've picked up on some, and we've certainly picked up on a number of real issues and problems that UK are facing. For me, it's to thank you all for participating in this discussion. It's been really, really good, very, very lively, and I think there are a few bits of homework which we as the German-British Society can pick up on, and will certainly remember what has been said and act upon it. So thanks a lot. Thanks for joining us. Thanks to everybody. And we'll certainly continue with this type of sort of, short notice active discussions. Thank you and have a nice evening.